Tonight on The Green Swindle, a special edition of Hannity. Now, liberals have told us for years that if we don't adopt their policies and give them more control over our lives, environmental Armageddon will be just around the bend. Now, they say science is on their side, and there's nothing left to debate. Tonight, we will expose some glaring errors in this so-called science and show you how scientists, politicians, and big business have turned global warming hysteria into a multi-billion-dollar industry. But first, how environmentalism turned into fear-mongering over the climate, and we start at the beginning of The Green Swindle.
The planet has a fever.
The threat from climate change is serious, it is urgent, and it is growing.
Global warming hysteria is spreading across the country.
The entire relationship between humanity and our planet has been radically altered.
People live in fear that the planet will perish unless they drastically alter how they go about their daily lives. But how did the issue of preserving the environment dissolve into the present-day global warming fear-mongering? Now, to understand how the movement became so distorted, experts say we can look at certain events in history.
The modern environmental movement sprang up in the 1960s and very early 1970s, and it represented a huge, wholesale break with the traditional conservation movement that existed in America for about 100 years.
Two significant books were published in the 1960s that made the modern environmental movement what it is today. In 1962, Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, was released. In the book, Carson condemns the overuse of pesticides.
Aerial spraying of pesticides should be brought under strict control.
Al Gore wrote that Silent Spring had a profound impact on his life. Indeed, Rachel Carson was one of the reasons why I became so conscious of the environment and so involved with environmental issues.
Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, is often credited with paving the way for the environmental movement. It was just a time when there was a challenge to authority stemming partly from the Vietnam War, the sense that the leadership of the country might be taking us in wrong directions. That carried over then to environmental issues as well.
This was read widely by people across the nation, and particularly by students. This was during the period where the student revolution was breaking out in the United States. Instead of always holding up Chairman Mao's little red book as their Bible, they just rediscovered Rachel Carson's little green book.
And then in 1968, Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, argued that, quote, we must rapidly bring the world's population under control. Now, Ehrlich predicted that overcrowding was causing the world's environmental problems and would lead to mass famine. On the cover, it reads, quote, while you're reading these words, 4 people will have died from starvation, most of them children.
These books are bestsellers because they foretell doom and gloom, and the population bomb was all about doom and gloom. And most of what Paul Ehrlich, in fact, if not all of what Paul Ehrlich wrote, has been disproven over time.
In his book, Ehrlich suggests that the government should allow, quote, voluntary sterilization for both sexes and give, quote, a series of financial rewards and penalties designed to discourage reproduction.
People who got involved in movements like the anti-war movement, they found that it was in some ways an enjoyable experience. So when the war finally did wind down, they were looking for another crusade to join.
These two books were instrumental in the creation of Earth Day.
It was on April 22nd, 1970. That same date happens to be the birthday of Lenin. A lot of folks will tell you, oh, well, that's just a coincidence. But there were a lot of the young radical environmentalists at the time who thought this was really clever. This was an in-your-face to capitalism.
An estimated 20 million people participated in that first Earth Day festivities across the country. And so the environmental hysteria began. The fear of global cooling started in the 1970s. Now, a cover story in the 1975 issue of Newsweek magazine elevated the hysteria to a national level. Now, oddly, these fears would eventually morph into global warming as the science indicated that the temperatures were rising and not falling. But in the coming decade, the movement would mesh with politics, leaving environmentalists at a crossroad. Patrick Moore was one of the founding members of Greenpeace.
Around the mid-1980s, the environmental movement was basically hijacked by the political left, and at the same time, the Berlin Wall came down, communism ended, and a lot of peaceniks who were basically anti-American and leftist in their orientation moved into the environmental movement, bringing their sort of neo-Marxism with them. And they learn to use green language in a clever way to cloak agendas that basically have more to do with anti-capitalism and anti-globalization than anything to do with science or ecology.
Patrick Moore left Greenpeace in 1986.
I left Greenpeace really for two reasons. One was the larger issue that I wanted to get out of just pure confrontation politics, just telling people what they should stop doing, and start to work with people to find solutions for the environment and sustainability. And when the environmental movement became so strongly politicized, left against right, it was time for me to leave.
But it wasn't just environmental groups that began pushing their political agendas.
This really got going officially in Washington in 1988 when James Hansen, who is a scientist at NASA, came and testified in front of Congress about global warming and claiming that it was a big issue, that it was real. This was what put this on Congress's radar.
And from there, the movement began to inflate the political dialogue.
Up until probably the middle of the 1990s, you had all these environmental groups out there, and they all had their own concerns and their own causes, and they had to pick their spots.
And in 2006, the poster child for global warming came out with his now infamous movie.
Here's Manhattan. The World Trade Center Memorial would be underwater. Think of the impact of a couple 100,000 refugees, and then imagine 100 million.
For some reason, the combination of people's desire for entertainment and for celebrities has one after another brought people to the forefront as heroes, such as Al Gore, such as Paul Ehrlich, who really, don't necessarily have all the answers. I mean, it's absolutely crazy. Al Gore is not a scientist. He hasn't got a scientific bone in his body. He's a politician. He's a mass mover of propaganda.
Al Gore's movie came out, and again, it was suddenly all over the popular culture, and you had a guy who was out there that everybody knew, and he became the face of this, that simply raised public awareness of this.
And this brings us to present day, where global warming is not necessarily a movement anymore, but actually an indisputable fact.
They have basically taken the science out of it, and instead there's this mixture of sensationalism, misinformation, and fear.